time and said lovely things and heartfelt things and gone, and you said, really, I was really, I was touched by it, and I said, I would like to celebrate his life.
Mel Brooks has spent nearly a century making the world laugh, from a kitchen table in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to the stages of Broadway, from a foxhole in Belgium to the highest awards in film, television, and theater. His life sounds like a story he might have written himself. But underneath all of it, there is grief that most people never fully see. At 99, the tragedy of Mel Brooks is beyond heartbreaking. Brownsville, 1926, the boy without a father. Melvin James Kaminsky came into the world on June 28, 1926, born on his family's kitchen table at 515 Powell Street in Brownsville, Brooklyn. The family later moved to Williamsburg, where they rented a tenement apartment at 365 South 3rd Street. He had 3 older brothers, Irving, Lenny, and Bernie, and a mother named Katie, born Brookman, a Russian Jewish immigrant. His father, Max Kaminsky, was a process server from a German Jewish family originally from Danzig. Max died when Mel was 2 years old, tuberculosis of the kidney, at 34. Mel Brooks has talked about that loss his entire life, circling around it the way you circle a wound that never quite closes. He said it plainly once, "There's an outrage there. I may be angry at God or at the world for that. And I'm sure a lot of my comedy is based on anger and hostility." Growing up in Williamsburg during the Depression, in a tenement with 4 boys and a widowed mother who took in piecework sewing from the garment center to make ends meet, young Melvin learned early that the safest way to handle rage was to make people laugh. He clothed it in comedy, he said, to avoid getting punched in the face. He was a sickly boy, often bullied. He was short, he was loud, he was relentlessly, exhaustingly funny, with the particular desperation of someone who had discovered that funny was armor, that a laugh in time could stop a punch, that making the bigger boy laugh was safer than trying to outrun him. His mother's maiden name, Brookman, was the name he would eventually borrow for his own. When he started playing drums in his teens and needed a name for the front of his kit, he spelled out Mel Brookman, and realized he had too many letters and not enough space. He shortened it, Mel Brooks, the name his father never knew. At 14, he was performing as a poolside tumbler at a second-rate Catskills hotel called the Butler Lodge, wearing a derby hat and a large overcoat weighted down with rocks, standing on a diving board and announcing to the pool guests that business was terrible and he simply couldn't go on. Before jumping, fully dressed, into the pool, people laughed. That was the beginning. Buddy Rich, the great jazz drummer who had also grown up in Williamsburg, was about 9 years older than Mel and gave him drum lessons. Within 6 months, Brooks was good enough to play paying gigs. He had rhythm in his bones, and that rhythm would later show up in his comedy the way it shows up in jazz. The setup, the fill, the payoff, the silence before the punchline lands. The war and coming home. He graduated from Eastern District High School in Williamsburg in January 1944. He intended to go to Brooklyn College and study psychology, following his older brother's path. Then the Army called. He was sent to the Virginia Military Institute as part of the Army Specialized Training Program, where he was taught electrical engineering, horse riding, and saber fighting, a combination of skills that would prove immediately useless on any actual battlefield. He was then shipped overseas and assigned to the 1,104th Engineer Combat Battalion as a combat engineer. He arrived in Europe in late 1944 and participated in the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army in the entire Second World War. His job as a combat engineer included building makeshift bridges for advancing American troops. It also included defusing landmines. He talked about what he saw along those frozen roads: soldiers wrapped in mattress covers, stacked in ditches waiting to be collected. He said he sang all the time because he never wanted to think about it. He said death was the enemy more than any German soldier was. You fight both, he suggested, but you only hate one of them, and the other one you just have to keep moving past if you want to get home. There is a well-known story about Brooks discovering a German loudspeaker system one night, playing a Wehrmacht record across the front lines. He picked up a bullhorn and serenaded the enemy with his best rendition of an American song, loud and cheerful across no man's land. He heard German soldiers shouting back their appreciation. It is a completely Mel Brooks story, using comedy to stare death in the face and refuse to blink. He came home from the war, and his mother had found him a job as a clerk at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He lasted approximately as long as it took him to hail a cab and direct it to the Catskills. He became a tumbler at Grossinger's, one of the most famous Borscht Belt resorts in the country, performing, cajoling, insulting the guests with affection, doing whatever it took to keep the room laughing. He also did some stand-up, some radio work, some summer stock theater in New Jersey. He was building something, though he couldn't yet see what shape it would take. The room that remade American comedy. In 1950, Sid Caesar launched Your Show of Shows on NBC, and Mel Brooks was hired as one of its writers. He was 23 years old and being paid $50 a week off the books, which was the beginning of a working relationship with Caesar that would define his entire first act in show business. The writing room for Your Show of Shows has become one of the legendary spaces in the history of American comedy, a pressure cooker of Jewish New York talent that included Carl Reiner, Neil Simon, and his brother Danny, Larry Gelbart, Mel Tolkien, and later Woody Allen. They worked under relentless deadlines. The show ran 90 minutes live every single week with no safety net. The pressure was extraordinary and unrelenting. Reiner later based the character of Buddy Sorrell on the Dick Van Dyke Show directly on Brooks. Neil Simon's 1993 play, Laughter on the 23rd Floor, is also a dramatization of that writing room, with a character called Ira Stone, based on Brooks. The film, My Favorite Year, is loosely drawn from the same period, with a young writer based partly on Brooks. That room produced 3 major American comedians and playwrights, and changed what television comedy looked like. Caesar was a towering physical presence and a ferocious talent, and could be terrifying to work for. Brooks, short and frantic and overflowing with ideas, threw himself against the wall of the room with everything he had every single week. At its peak, he was earning $5,000 a week, but the pressure was becoming something darker. Brooks has admitted that during this period he contemplated suicide 13 or 14 times. He said he had the pills. He said his wife Florence had to talk him back from the edge of an uptown pedestrian bridge one night. He began seeing a psychoanalyst, which helped him come back. He kept working. Carl Reiner, A Father Found. In the corridors and break rooms of Your Show of Shows, Mel Brooks found something he had been missing since he was 2 years old. Carl Reiner was 4 years older, tall, calm, wise, generous, and he saw in the frantic little man from Williamsburg something genuinely extraordinary. They began improvising comedy routines together at parties. Reiner playing the straight man interviewer, Brooks playing whatever wildly unlikely character Reiner pointed him at. A caveman, a Tibetan monk, a man who had been alive for 2,000 years. The 2,000-year-old man routine was born sometime in the early 1950s, in the living rooms of colleagues and friends. Reiner would turn to Brooks and say he was interviewing a man who had actually been present at the crucifixion 2,000 years earlier. And Brooks would launch into a Yiddish-inflected old man who remembered Jesus as a thin young fellow who always came into the store and never bought anything. The audiences fell apart. Kenneth Tynan, the great British theater critic, saw them perform the routine at a party in 1959 and wrote that Brooks was the most original comic improviser he had ever seen. Steve Allen eventually pushed them into a recording studio in 1960. The first album sold enormously. More albums followed. In 1999, at the Grammy Awards, their final version of the routine won Best Spoken Comedy Album, 40 years of partnership, performed and recorded across 5 decades, culminating in a Grammy when Mel was 72 and Carl was 77. Brooks has described Carl Reiner as his father, not metaphorically, or not only metaphorically. He had lost his actual father at 2 years old and spent his whole childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood looking for something to replace that. I always thought that even though Mel was only about 4 years younger than my dad, he looked to my dad as a father figure, Rob Reiner said in the HBO documentary about Brooks. Brooks agreed. I was always searching for some guidance from an older man, and Carl was nice and tall. I literally looked up to Carl. He paused a beat and added, because he cannot help himself. I literally looked up to Carl. The joke is in the delivery, but the feeling underneath it is entirely real. Anne Bancroft, The Love Story. In 1961, Mel Brooks was at a rehearsal for a Perry Como television special at the Ziegfeld Theater. Anne Bancroft was rehearsing a number. She was Anna Maria Luisa Italiano from the Bronx, the daughter of Italian immigrants, already a Tony Award winner for The Miracle Worker on Broadway. She was one of the most gifted actresses of her generation. She was also, by any standard, strikingly beautiful. Brooks heard her sing. When the number ended, he leapt to his feet, applauded wildly, and shouted across the theater, "Anne Bancroft, I love you!" She looked up and shouted back, "Who the hell are you?" He told her his name and said she had probably never heard of him. She corrected him, "Wrong! I've got your 2,000-year-old man record with Carl Reiner. It's great." That was the beginning. He spent 3 years making enough money to marry her. They wed on August 5th, 1964, at the Manhattan Marriage Bureau. Their son Maximilian, Max Brooks, was born in 1972, named for the father Mel had never known, Max Kaminsky. The marriage lasted 41 years, until the only thing that could end it did. Anne described what Mel meant to her in a handful of words that have been quoted many times since, because there are no better ones. "When I hear his key in the lock at night, my heart starts to beat faster." She said that in an interview during their marriage, and it became one of those quotes about a relationship that people repeat, because it says exactly what it means to love someone and keep on loving them. Brooks wrote in his 2021 memoir, All About Me, that she was just incredibly beautiful when he first saw her, and that the feeling never changed. Their son Max put it differently in the documentary. "My dad was the water, and my mother was the glass, and when the glass shattered, I was worried the water was going to go everywhere." The work, that changed everything. Between meeting Anne and losing her, Mel Brooks built one of the most remarkable careers in American entertainment. The Producers opened in 1967. It was his debut as a director. The story of two theatrical con men, the thunderous Zero Mostel and the terrified, blinking Gene Wilder, trying to mount a guaranteed Broadway flop. It won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay in 1968. In 1974, he made 2 films in the same calendar year that are both in the American Film Institute's list of the top 15 American comedies of all time, Blazing Saddles at number 6 and Young Frankenstein at number 13. The Producers itself sits at number 11, 3 films from the same director in the top 15. Blazing Saddles was a Western parody that took direct aim at American racism, with a ferocity and a silliness that somehow coexisted, written with Richard Pryor and others, and set loose on audiences who had never seen anything like it. More careful and more precise than Blazing Saddles, and arguably more beloved. When the cameras rolled, Mel Brooks had a cast that included Wilder, Marty Feldman. Every one of them was extraordinary. Most of them are gone now. In 2001, The Producers became a Broadway musical. The original film was turned into a stage show with music and lyrics by Brooks himself. It won 12 Tony Awards, a record for a single production. 3 of those Tonys went to Mel Brooks for Best Musical, Best Book, and Best Original Score. With those wins, he completed the EGOT. He had been working since 1949, and he completed it at 74. The Emmy had come in 1967, the Oscar in 1968, to the last piece of one of entertainment's rarest achievements. He also produced, under the Brooks Films banner, films that carried none of his name in the credits, because he suspected nobody would take a serious drama seriously with Mel Brooks' presence on the poster. The Elephant Man in 1980, Francis, The Fly, My Favorite Year, 84 Charing Cross Road, which starred Anne Bancroft alongside Anthony Hopkins. He was proud of all of it and took none of the credit publicly. Marty Feldman, 48 years old in Mexico City. Marty Feldman had those extraordinary misaligned eyes, the result of Graves's disease, a thyroid condition, and a genius for physical comedy that made him unforgettable as Igor in Young Frankenstein. The character was called Igor, but he insisted it be pronounced Igor, and his brief exchange with Gene Wilder's Frankenstein about the proper pronunciation is one of the most quoted moments in the film. He and Brooks became close through the making of that movie and stayed close. Feldman also appeared in Silent Movie in 1976, reuniting the Young Frankenstein circle one more time. In 1982, Feldman was in Mexico City filming a comedy adventure called Yellowbeard, a picture that brought together an astounding collection of comic talent, including Graham Chapman, Peter Boyle, Madeline Kahn, John Cleese. He suffered a heart attack in his hotel room on the night of December 2nd, 1982. He was 48 years old. He did not make it to a hospital. The film Yellowbeard was subsequently dedicated to his memory. Brooks spoke candidly about Feldman's lifestyle, the cigarettes, the coffee, the diet, but none of that softens what it was. A man of genuinely rare gifts, gone at 48 on a film set far from his wife and his home, before he had done close to everything he was capable of doing. He was younger than most people's parents. He had barely started. Madeline Kahn, a voice like no other. Madeline Kahn appeared in Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein within the same year, which is an extraordinary thing to have on a single resume. In Blazing Saddles, she played Lily von Stupp, a Marlene Dietrich parody delivering song and innuendo with pitch-perfect deadpan, and she received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress for it. In Young Frankenstein, she played Elizabeth, the fastidious fiancée who arrives at the castle and gets more than she bargained for. She was in both films, both released in 1974, and she was spectacular in each. She went on to appear in several other Mel Brooks productions and became one of those actors so closely associated with his world that it is genuinely difficult to imagine some of those films without her. Her comic timing was internal and precise in a way that looked effortless because she made everything look effortless. She was also trained in opera, and her voice was remarkable. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer and died on December 3rd, 1999. She was 57 years old. She died one day after the 17th anniversary of Marty Feldman's death. Two of the most vivid performers in those films, gone years apart at ages that felt impossible. Brooks has rarely spoken at length about her death in public. Some losses do not need annotation. Gene Wilder, inconsolable. Gene Wilder was perhaps Mel Brooks's greatest collaborator. They met on The Producers when Wilder was cast as Leo Bloom, the nervous, blanket-clutching accountant who agrees to help steal money from a Broadway production that is guaranteed to fail. Brooks watched what Wilder did with the role and understood immediately that he had found something rare. Wilder insisted, before agreeing to play the Waco Kid in Blazing Saddles, that Brooks would commit to making Young Frankenstein next. Brooks agreed. Wilder came to him with the concept for Young Frankenstein, and they co-wrote the screenplay together. The collaboration was among the most creatively productive in comedy history. Then Wilder was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 2010. He kept the diagnosis private for years, protecting his audience, specifically the children who knew him as Willy Wonka. He didn't want a single child's face to change when they saw him, to shift from delight to worry. His widow, Karen Boyer, later said he may never have fully understood that he was ill because the disease had already affected the parts of his memory that would have told him something was wrong. Brooks called him constantly in those years, trying to use shared memories as a kind of medicine, throwing out references to scenes they had made together, hoping to coax Wilder back through the fog. I called him a lot, thinking, maybe if I gave him enough references, I could get him out of it. Insanity on my part. He was in the throes of that terrible disease. We could never talk too long after he got it. It was so sad. It made me cry a lot. Gene Wilder died on August 29, 2016, at his home in Stamford, Connecticut. He was 83. He died, according to his family, while listening to a recording of Over the Rainbow, sung by Ella Fitzgerald. Brooks told an interviewer, "I was inconsolable for a couple of weeks. When he lived his life, he lived it loud and eloquently. He was an outstanding actor and also an outstanding person." He paused and said, "I miss his enjoying my humor. I could make him laugh, where he would sometimes grab his belly, hit the ground, and roll around laughing. That's the real payment in being a comic." And boy, he paid. Anne Bancroft, June 6, 2005. Anne Bancroft was deeply private about her illness, in the way she was private about most things that truly mattered to her. She did not discuss her diagnosis publicly. She had been nominated for 5 Academy Awards across her career and had won for The Miracle Worker in 1962, playing Anne Sullivan in one of the finest performances in American film history. She had won 2 Tony Awards on Broadway. She was, by any measure, one of the most gifted theatrical and cinematic figures of her entire generation. She died on June 6, 2005, at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan. She was 73 years old. It was uterine cancer. She had kept the severity of her condition from almost everyone, including many of her close friends, who were shocked when the news broke. Eddie Brooks, Mel's son from his first marriage, said it plainly. All the light went out. He was not in a good place. Eddie had watched his father worship Anne for over 4 decades. We never dreamed that Anne would ever get sick or ultimately pass away. He just worshipped her. After she died, Mel Brooks kept coming back to the apartment, kept going through the days, kept working, because that is what he had always done with unbearable things. He clothed them in activity. He had learned that as a boy in Williamsburg. His granddaughter Samantha described sitting with her grandfather and watching old footage of Anne together, watching her sing and perform and be herself on a screen. Samantha said that felt like it healed something she didn't know was broken. Carl Reiner, 70 years, then gone. After Anne Bancroft died in 2005, and after Carl Reiner's wife Estelle died in 2008, the 2 old friends spent nearly every evening together. They lived close to each other in Los Angeles, and the nightly ritual became a kind of institution that people in their circle knew about and spoke of with something like reverence. They would watch Jeopardy together. They would eat dinner. Carl would set up the premise, and Mel would launch. Still, after 60 years, unable to stop, and Carl still genuinely, helplessly laughing. Jerry Seinfeld filmed them doing this for an episode of Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee and described witnessing it as one of the great privileges of his professional life. 2 men in their 90s, widowed and ancient and still funnier than most people a third their age. Carl Reiner died on June 29, 2020. He was 98 years old. According to the HBO documentary, Mel Brooks was there in Carl's house when Carl collapsed. Brooks screamed at the medics for an hour, refusing to accept what was happening in front of him. Rob Reiner said his father's final days had been full of Mel. The 2 of them together in exactly the way they had been for 70 years, since that writing room in 1950. "Mel was there when my dad died," Rob said. "I always thought Carl was there," Brooks said afterward. "I literally looked up to Carl. I felt that Carl was there. I was very close to him." After Carl died, Brooks kept going to Carl's house for months and months. He couldn't stop. He would walk over thinking Carl was still there, then remember and go anyway. Rob Reiner, December 14, 2025. There is one more loss on this list, and it is the kind of loss that strains even the vocabulary of tragedy. Rob Reiner, Carl's son, the director of Stand By Me and When Harry Met Sally and A Few Good Men, was 78 years old. He had been part of Mel Brooks's extended family for his entire life. He was a toddler when his father Carl and Mel Brooks were improvising the 2,000-year-old man at parties in people's living rooms. He grew up knowing Brooks as a kind of uncle, a satellite presence in the Reiner household, the short, loud man who could make his father laugh until he fell down. Rob Reiner had spoken in interviews over the years about what Brooks meant to his father and to their family. He appeared on the HBO documentary about Brooks in interviews recorded in May 2024, speaking warmly and at length about a friendship that had lasted across both families for more than 70 years. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were also close to Brooks in their own right. After Carl's death in 2020, Brooks had continued to spend time with the Reiner family, a connection sustained through grief, through shared memory, through the unbreakable bond of having loved the same man. On December 14th, 2025, Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle Singer Reiner were found dead in their Brentwood home. Rob was 78, Michelle was 70. Their 32-year-old son, Nick, was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At the premiere of the HBO documentary in January 2026, which features Rob Reiner's interviews prominently, recorded 7 months before his death, Brooks was asked in the post-screening Q&A about Carl. He paused. He said he was glad Carl had passed away when he did. He never could have survived this terrible, terrible thing, Brooks said. The documentary that was supposed to celebrate one of comedy's greatest friendships had become, in the weeks before its premiere, something far more solemn than anyone intended. Rob Reiner appears multiple times in the film, speaking with clarity and affection about a man he had known his whole life. He did not know those interviews would be among the last recorded footage of him. Still working, still here. In June 2025, Mel Brooks announced that a sequel to Spaceballs, his 1987 Star Wars parody, was in production. With a target release date of 2027, he would reprise his dual roles as Yogurt and President Scroob. Josh Gad co-wrote the screenplay and would star alongside returning cast members Bill Pullman and Rick Moranis, who came out of a long retirement specifically for the project. Josh Greenbaum would direct. The production had involvement from Brian Grazer and Ron Howard through Imagine Entertainment and principal photography, wrapped in December 2025 in Sydney, Australia. Gad described Brooks at 98 as entirely on form, so effortlessly funny and so unbelievably brilliant, and said working with him was one of the great privileges of his career. The title of the sequel was announced at CinemaCon in April 2026, Spaceballs, the New One. Brooks explained why they weren't calling it Spaceballs 2, The Search for More Money, the title fans had expected for decades, referencing the original film's own joke about sequels. "I found the money," he said. "It was in my basement." At the same time, he is executive producing Very Young Frankenstein, a television project for FX, returning, as he has done repeatedly across a 70-year career, to the material that mattered most. He wrote and produced History of the World, Part 2 for Hulu in 2023, narrating from his living room at 96. He received an Honorary Academy Award in 2024 at 97. In January 2026, Judd Apatow and Michael Bonfilio's 2-part HBO documentary, Mel Brooks, The 99-Year-Old Man, premiered on HBO Max. It is as complete and human a portrait of Brooks as has ever been assembled, covering the childhood, the war, the writing room, the films, the 2,000-year-old man, Anne, Carl, and the ongoing improbability of the man himself. It includes the last on-screen interviews with both Rob Reiner and director David Lynch, both of whom died in the months between filming and the documentary's premiere. What it means to live to 99. Mel Brooks turns 100 on June 28, 2026, when When Spaceballs the new one opens in theaters in April 2027, he will have crossed that threshold. He is the man the 2,000-year-old man was always on some level about. The man who has been alive long enough to have seen almost everything, who carries the memory of a world that no longer exists, who can describe what it felt like when certain things were still new because he was there when they were new. He was born on a kitchen table in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to parents who had survived poverty and immigration and the particular violence that followed Jewish families across Europe and into America. His father died before Mel could know him. His mother raised 4 boys on piecework sewing. He scraped together a career in nightclubs and on television, survived the Battle of the Bulge, survived the collapse of his first marriage, survived years of financial uncertainty, and then built something that no one else in the history of entertainment has built in quite the same way. But the architecture of a long life includes its losses, and Mel Brooks has outlived so many of the people who made his life what it was. He has outlived his wife of 41 years, Anne, who said her heart beat faster when she heard his key in the lock. He has outlived the man he called his father twice over. First his actual father at age 2, then Carl Reiner at 93, when he stood in Carl's house and shouted at the medics as if volume alone could change what had happened. He has outlived Gene Wilder, who laughed at his jokes by grabbing his belly and rolling on the ground. He has outlived Marty Feldman at 48, and Madeline Kahn at 57. He has outlived Rob Reiner, who recorded his final interview about how much Brooks meant to Carl and was killed 7 months later in an act of violence that defies comprehension. He has buried almost everyone he loved, and yet he is making a Spaceball sequel. He is producing a Frankenstein television series. He sits down for documentaries and makes Judd Apatow laugh. He says, when asked how to get through the terrible things, you just find something in you that gives you the grit and the courage to get through the bad times that come after somebody you love passes away. There is a Mel Brooks joke buried in that sentence if you look for it. The bad times that come after. As if they come after. As if they have an ending. As if there is a morning after the hardest night. He has spent 99 years making the joke. He cannot stop. He would not know who to be if he stopped. The kitchen table in Brownsville, the boots on frozen Belgian ground, the car doors and diving boards and a derby hat full of rocks. That is what it looks like. From the outside, to have lived a life this full and this long and this painful and this rich. It is funny and enormous and heartbreaking all at once, which is, come to think of it, exactly the kind of story that Mel Brooks has always told best. There are not many people left who were there when American comedy was being invented from scratch. In those television writing rooms in the early 1950s, with the deadlines bearing down and Sid Caesar pacing the floor and a bunch of young Jewish kids from Brooklyn and the Bronx trying to make a live audience laugh every single week. Mel Brooks is one of the last of them. He has spent his whole life doing the thing he figured out as a boy in Williamsburg, clothing the outrage in comedy, sparing himself the punch in the face. He has done it with a father he never knew, and a war he had to sing through, and a writing room where the pressure nearly broke him, and a marriage of 41 years that ended when the glass shattered, and friends who died before anyone was ready for them to die, and losses that would have flattened a lesser person years and years ago. He turned 100 on June 28, 2026. In 2027, Spaceballs, the new one, is due in theaters. At 99, he announced it. At 100, he will see it released. He found the money. It was there in his basement. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below, like the video, and subscribe. There is plenty more where Mel Brooks came from, and the story isn't finished yet.